It's 1985, Microsoft Windows has just become available. Back to the Future is in the cinemas, Boris Becker has just won Wimbledon, and Renault released this, the Alpine GTA Turbo. Microsoft Windows is now the most popular operating system in the world. Sadly, despite very good reviews, the GTA didn't emulate that success. In this video, we're going to talk about why. But first, let me tell you about a few things that you probably didn't know. GTA stands for Gran Turismo Alpine. French viewers, please forgive me for that terrible pronunciation. This was the first Alpine produced entirely by Renault. Before that, they had a relationship, but Alpine was still an independent concern. This was the most aerodynamic car in its class. The base version had a CD of just 0.28, and this, the Turbo, which has a bit more body kit and spoilers, 0.3, which is still amazing. The fiberglass body meant that although it had less power than a 911, it was just as fast. In most of the world, it was known as the Alpine GTA. In the UK though, you will notice this has a Renault badge on the front. That is because Talbot Chrysler owned the rights to the name Alpine. So here, it was simply known as the Renault GTA. Like the 911, this also has the idiosyncratic placement of the engine right in the back of the car. In this case, the PRV V6 in naturally aspirated form, 158 horsepower. In this car, the Turbo, 200. And interestingly, I mentioned Back to the Future earlier, that has the DeLorean, which used the same engine. So an interesting car then. But perhaps the reason why it didn't sell is simply because it was rubbish. Let's find out. This car replaced the A3 which dates back to the 70s, and the main structure isn't really very far changed. This is though longer, wider and a little bit taller, which means that you get a bit more space in the back. So those rear seats are genuinely kind of usable. Certainly they're better than those in the back of a 911. Something else that happened when Renault took over and started doing production themselves is that they did streamlining a bit. Now, believe it or not, the previous car, the A310, each car took 130 hours to produce, which is monumental even by 80 standards. Renault managed to change the process slightly for this one, so it was brought down, well, almost halved really, to 77. Still not great, but for a niche car, it was verging on acceptable. So just 200 horsepower doesn't sound like that much, but turbo delivery often makes a car feel quicker than you're expecting. So let's see what this one is like. I don't know, maybe it's the low weight as well. It's 1150 to 1200 kilos for one of these, so about 50 kilos lighter than 3.2 Carrera. But certainly to me, it feels like it's a little bit peppier than a Carrera would be of that vintage anyway. Now this car is owned by Greg, who I have never met but have known for a long time. We both started on Renlist, the 964 forums, and have kept in touch ever since. It's quite interesting because it actually belonged to, I think, a friend of his father-in-law, who really doted on this and loved this. This was his favorite car, favorite project, but for some reason it ended up sort of being left out in the backyard of a garage for years and years, and Greg rescued it and then, of all things, decided that he was going to use it as a track day car once he'd done the various jobs that needed doing. Very, very oddball choice. Driving position is pretty good. Certainly there's more room and it's better than on the A310, which I really, really liked, but it was very compromised. I can sit in this, no problem. I could do a long journey. There's enough room for my head. It's spacious, it's comfortable. Reach to the wheel is good as well. The turbo delivery is really 80s, so if the turbo isn't already on boost, there's quite a bit of delay before it responds. And it responds harder than you're expecting. It also has, you can hear the turbo spooling up as it sort of spins up, which is quite endearing. But that little lag, you'd have to really factor it in before you were too ham-fisted on the tighter bends. The steering, I can already tell, is one of the standout elements of this GTA. It's light, it's unassisted, so it has a strong sort of self-centering, but it's all very intuitive. The weighing is perfect, the speed of it is really good, and you get so much feedback coming back through the wheel. And again, slow in and then mash the pedal. And there's so much grip at the rear. Let's take it through the gears again. When the torque comes in initially, it will push that nose wide. You've really got to be settled before you put the power on, otherwise it doesn't like it. And on these little twisties, it's trickier with that throttle response. It's lovely though, that mid-range is very addictive. From 3 to sort of 4.5, it really pulls hard, and it doesn't particularly drop off. It keeps going up to 6, so pretty good for a turbocharged unit. But the steering is just lovely. It's the weighing, and it's the way that the weighing varies depending on the angle that you're steering at. It's very addictive and it just feels great. Pedals are really well placed for heel and towing, so much so that occasionally when you're braking hard, you might end up pressing that throttle pedal. As you'd come to expect from a French car, the ride is really good and it feels like a really well sorted car. Now, Hoovy did a review on one of these a few years back, and he almost climaxed, I think, when it was in this car because he liked it so much.
This is a 1985 Renault Alpine, and it's amazing.
And I can see why. You know, he was sort of beside himself going on about how well they drive. He was also, actually though, really impressed by the interior. And that is something that I don't share with him. I mean, okay, this was a car of the 80s. It came out in 84, 85, but there's a lot in common here with Renault 5s. This dash perhaps is a little bit softer feel, slightly nicer material than you'd get in the Renault 5, but everything else is pretty low rent. I mean, it's not unpleasant because it is a car of its era, but I wouldn't really be shouting about the interior, except for the Vela seats, which are just incredible. They support you in just the right places, and they've got the softness that cars of this era still had. You know what, it's beautiful, it's beautiful. You just go into the corner, right on the cusp with the turbo spinning, and then you ease it out, and it just sort of, it's like a rubber band pulling you through the corner. Once you've got it settled, then it will stick. It's it's also a very stable car. So compared to a 911, I feel that the steering still has that incredible communication, and it's nice and light, but it just feels a little bit less nervous, a bit more settled. I don't know why that would be. Perhaps it's the type of suspension. I think 911s of this era had suspension that was a little bit more agricultural than this. Now, a lot of the period reviews, although they did like these cars, one of the complaints was the PRV engine has never been held in huge regard. And it's not just that it doesn't deliver a huge sort of specific output, but it's also that up towards the top end, it doesn't sound that nice and feels a bit rough. So in many cars, the turbo application kind of ruins the feel of the engine. In this, it doesn't. I think, actually, I'm sure that Greg has changed the exhaust. So it's a little bit louder than standard, and to me it just gives it that extra bit of character. You don't notice that the engine is maybe a little bit rougher up at the top end, or maybe it's smoother, I don't know, but this feels as good as any PRV that I've ever been in. Greg tells me that it really didn't disgrace itself on track, and I can see why. All he's done is put some race pads at the front, I think, to get better braking. But apart from that, it really does have, I think, enough power for most of the smaller tracks. And as long as you play with that mid-range, the gear change is nice and precise and snappy. And I know I'm going to bore you again, but the steering is just fabulous. It really is so light. And apart from the exhaust, this car mechanically is completely standard. Now, in terms of market placement, this one was a bit odd because I think the lower normally aspirated version price-wise was closer to a 944, and with 160 horsepower but less weight, it was probably slightly faster. This one though cost 28,000 in 1988. And that's UK pounds, and in performance terms it's much closer. But it's actually, I think, to me it feels faster than the 3.2 Carrera, which cost 36,000. So although it was more expensive than the standard version, it was still a bit of a bargain for what you were getting. Despite that, it really didn't sell. Nowadays the story is again quite similar, because these used to be an absolute bargain. A turbo like this, you could get a really good car for about £10,000. That's no longer the case, but still, a naturally aspirated car is about £7,000, something like that, 7 to 10, like a workable, okay one. The turbos, really, you're looking at sort of a 12 to 20, 25 maybe price range. That is more money now. I don't think it's too much money for what they are, because they are such interesting cars and they really do drive incredibly well. It's weird to think that they just didn't sell, but I think there's a couple of very simple reasons for it. First of all, it was simply too quirky. If you look at what the French have done with the new Alpine, they didn't try and compete with an existing car to any degree. They didn't try and copy a 911. They went for something completely different. And they went for a car which is conventionally quite pretty. This looks like nothing else on the road. And it's so particular. Plus it had the plastic bodywork. And let's not forget what I mentioned earlier. The UK was a fairly big market for sports cars and for French cars, and this in the UK was just marketed as a plain old Renault, and that definitely won't have helped its chances. I had a look at car values last night, and they seem to vary from naturally aspirated cars starting about 7,000 or 8,000, turbo cars like this one about 12 or 13, with 20 to 25 for the very, very best. But interestingly, both the cars for sale on Car and Classic are Category C write-offs, and I wonder, I didn't get close to the limits on this drive, but like a 911, it is possible that once it lets go, it's a bit spicy. they're not supposed to be. They're supposed to be a little bit more controllable. Again, I think because of the type of suspension this has, it wasn't as unfriendly as the Porsche, but still interesting to see. 2 for sale, both Cat C write-offs. Also, the quality certainly isn't up to 911 standards, so you have a few sort of rattles and noises. The speedo on this one isn't working. You can forgive it though, obviously. It's 100,000 miles almost. It's just about to trip over this particular car. And something else notable about the interior is that stereo. Look at that bit of 80s goodness. It's just a load of buttons. It has proper graphic equalizers. And I'm not going to bother, but Greg tells me that the sound is really pretty good. If these were still sort of approaching £10,000, I would just go out and buy one right now. And it's not that I'm saying they're not worth the money that they're costing now, it's just that it starts to become a bit more of an investment at that sort of money. But oh my God, they are absolutely brilliant. The way it drives, I honestly prefer this to a 911 of the era. Just think the suspension feels better, the setup is more mature. But, you know, the 911 is a more conventionally pretty looking car. It's much more solidly built. It's still good to drive. You know, there's a lot going for it, but these are so much cheaper. I don't know what a 3.2 would be now. An average 3.2, 60,000 perhaps. So, you know, a third of the price. And this does, trust me, it does drive better. Thank you so much to Greg for bringing it down. Thank you all so much for watching. If you want me to do a review on one of your cars, please do get in touch at this addresses, and I look forward to seeing you for the next video.